Space, the vast expanse. The long-time dream of human space exploration has laid amongst the stars for generations. Our ancestors thousands of years ago could not even conceive or understand the technology that makes this great feat possible. The story of human space exploration is laden with sacrifice and triumph, all in the name of advancing our presence and influence in our place among the stars. And despite all the great advances we have made, we have yet to even scratch the surface.
The mid-20th century saw humanity's entrance into space. The epic space race between the two giant superpowers, the USA and the Soviet Union, gave way to some of the greatest feats in our history. The fierceness of competition between enemy powers, although teetering on the brink of global war, had its positive contributions. It established the supremacy of the United States, as well as proving that what seemed impossible could be done. It provided inspiration for generations to come. It gave us as a collective people a chance to look up and wonder what part we may play in the adventure into the stars.
The very first artificial satellite was launched into orbit by the Soviet Union in 1957, named Sputnik. It led the way for the ever-growing human presence in space. That same year, the Russians launched a second Sputnik satellite named Sputnik 2. However, this time on board was a dog named Laika, who became the first living being to be launched into space. Sadly, however, Laika did not survive her voyage. The following year, the United States launched their first satellite named Explorer 1. The nation was in a state of shock after seeing the Soviets' recent achievements in space, and thus saw a need to prove their supremacy against the communists.
On August 19, 1960, the Soviets launched Sputnik 5, carrying aboard two dogs named Strelka and Belka, and were the first living organisms to survive a space journey. In their seemingly unstoppable charge to prove that they are the most powerful nation, the Soviets came out again with another big step. In 1961, Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to venture into space, but only a month later, the USA answered with their first man in space, Alan Shepard. 20 days later, President John F. Kennedy challenged the nation to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills.
By the late 60s, the U.S. government was spending over 2% of its budget on space exploration. Although it is a small piece of the pie, it remains the highest spending amount to date on any space endeavors, dwarfing today's mere 0.45%. These were the golden years for NASA, and they were hot on the Soviets' trail for putting an end to the space race. Following a series of manned launches and spacewalks, the United States was planning their final blow to the Soviets. This decade saw a new height of activity for the two space nations. In 1965 alone, the first spacewalk took place, as well as the first photos of Mars being returned to Earth by the American Mariner 4 probe.
1966. The Russian spacecraft Luna 9 became the first human device to land on the surface of the moon, followed closely by the American Surveyor 1, which became the first American spacecraft to land on the moon. 1967. Astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were killed in an accidental fire in the command module of the launch pad. Cosmonaut Vladimir M. Komarov was killed in a crash when the parachute to his Soyuz 1 spacecraft failed to deploy. A Soviet space probe became the first spacecraft to collect data about the atmosphere of Venus. 1968. Soviet spacecraft Zond 5 becomes the first craft to orbit the moon and return to Earth. December 21st, 1968. Apollo 8 carries her manned crew on an orbit around the moon and returns to Earth. Her human crew becomes the first to orbit the moon. 1969. Astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin become the first men to set foot on the moon. The eyes of the world watched as humanity took its first steps on an extraterrestrial world. This was the grand climax of the space race, and the United States had proven its dominance by putting men on the moon several more times, and no response from the Russians. The United States had made itself into the space nation. No other nation to this day has put men on the moon, and the American flag stands proud and alone on the lunar surface.